Looking forward to starting a new class. Probably going to run for about 4 weeks in here. And so this is just going to be a short class. And I debated a lot about what to do with these weeks. And I guess, is the mic on? I think it is. Yeah, I think it's kind of low. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. All right, so some of you know, Catherine and I are helping out with LTC, and we're doing the Bible Bowl group for the high school age. And so we're going through the book of Luke, and one of the things that keep coming across in the book of Luke, there are a lot of things that are challenging for the guys as we're going through it. And there's a lot of passages that, to be quite honest, when you run across it and you haven't thought about it in a while, it's kind of hard. It made me think of this passage in John chapter 6 when the disciples hear Jesus say that he's the bread of life and, eat my flesh and drink my blood. And they're like, this is a hard saying. I thought that might be a good title for this class because I want to take some time over the next few weeks to just dive in on some of the teachings that are a little bit more difficult that Jesus brought. The reason I want to do that is I think sometimes these harder sayings have a lot of depth to them, that we need to unpack, but we don't always go into them. And I think that's natural. There's nothing wrong with that. I think sometimes if you don't really know how to explain a passage, sometimes it's better judgment to move on to something that you have a firmer grasp of. So maybe I'm a little foolish in doing this class, but we're going to give it our best shot. But I believe that when we do what Jesus instructed us to do, and that is to seek, that we will find. And I think that when we do the work of looking at the teachings that he had for us that are more challenging, we're stepping out in faith and saying that on the surface, this is hard for me, and I don't really know where you're taking me, Lord, but I believe you're taking me somewhere good. So I want to look at some of those passages, and maybe you already feel like you've got a good grasp on some of these, and I'm looking forward to the comments that we have in here. One more caveat I'll add before we get into it is that when you're talking about passages that are harder to unpack, more challenging to understand, we have more diversity of viewpoint, right? It just makes sense. And because these passages aren't always taught a lot, people have had to come to their own conclusions at times. And so I just ask for grace from you and to have a open dialogue together, because I think that's healthy for us as a church, to share and understand that we're looking at some stuff that's not the easiest. But I think it's still worthwhile and important for us to look at these teachings of Jesus in faith that they'll lead us somewhere good. So here's a few that I want us to look at. I don't know if we'll get through all of these in these 4 weeks, and I am open to changing some of these out. So if there's a passage that you would like to look at, let's talk about it after class. And I don't know if it's going to be above my pay grade or not, but we'll talk about it. And I'm open to working in some others in here as well. But the two that I'm hoping that we can get through tonight are both from the book of Luke, and they're actually both, one of them is one that we've studied with our Bible Bowl boys last week, the first one. And then the second one is one that we're going to study with the Bible Bowl guys this coming week. And I thought, anybody who's in this room who's also involved with LTC, I think a class like this might be helpful too as well, because when you're coaching your kids and they have questions about these difficult passages, hopefully this can give us some dialogue and be ready to answer some of those tough questions. So, all right. So Luke chapter 14 is where I want you to turn to for us to start on. And this is the passage where Jesus famously talks about hating your family. Well, that sounds strange. Well, let's read it together. Let's see Luke chapter 14, and we're going to pick up in verse 25. Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." Oh, sorry, I was making sure my slide moved. "For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple." All right. So, at first glance, this seems like contradictory to what Jesus teaches about love and honoring our family. Right? Didn't Jesus command us to love our neighbors and honor our parents? And he criticized the Pharisees for neglecting their parents under religious pretenses. We know all of that. So obviously that's not what Jesus means here. He's not calling on us to hate our families. I think we all know that, but then the question is, well, what is he actually saying? So I want to start with each one of these by saying what Jesus is not teaching. And I know some of these, again, on their face, you're probably going to say, well, yeah. But I think it's important that we just go ahead and say it outright, that Jesus is not commanding literal hatred. That's not what he means when he uses that word here. Jesus is not contradicting his other teachings, obviously. We all know Jesus talks about loving others in some of the most challenging ways you can imagine. Loving your enemies and blessing those who curse you. And then Jesus is not condoning the neglect of family. So just get those three out of the way right out of the gate. So what is Jesus trying to teach us in this passage? Well, I think when he uses that word hate, what Jesus is actually saying is, if you were to compare the way that you are devoted to me to anything else, it should be as if you hate anything else in comparison. Like, there should be such a chasm between the two that if you even try to compare them, the only word that might even compare would be hate, not because you really hate, but because you love me so infinitely more by comparison. And I think that's why he segues over to the next part where he talks about counting the cost. Because to devote yourself completely in that way, where anything by comparison would look like hate, is a tremendous cost to you in the way that you're going to live your life. And part of that cost is that other people will not be happy with you. So I think in other parallel passages, there's also an emphasis or implication that by following Jesus, other people will not be happy. And even our own family members will at times turn against us, or especially to those who Jesus was speaking to at the time, who were going to have to eventually leave the way they had been raised in Judaism and follow this new rabbi who they believed was the Messiah. That was going to be divisive in a lot of families. And so think about the suffering and the sacrifice of those early converts to Jesus and what they were willing to do because they believed that he was their king. When you really wrap your mind around that, when you really think about how much they had to give up to follow him, and I think in a lot of ways it's easier for us than it would have been for people in that time. I know that they had advantages of their own. Eyewitnessing miracles, that would definitely do something for you that we are missing out on. But I think on the other hand, someone who comes along and at that time is new and bringing something that people haven't even wrapped their minds around, that would be very divisive and very difficult for some people to, obviously, we know from the way Jesus was received. So it can create conflict, and we must count the cost. Counting the cost of discipleship is something that I think we maybe take for granted because we live in a culture that is already amenable to being a Christian. I'll never forget, when we moved up to Minnesota, I was working at Mayo Clinic in the hospital there, and my manager and I were chatting I guess it was before I was hired, in an interview. And he asked me, questions, trying to get to know me in this interview. And I remember being very open about being a Christian and that being an important part of my life. And at the end of the interview, he made a point to tell me that being so vocal about my faith was not necessarily a good thing in this setting. And that struck me, because I had never had anybody say something like that to me. Growing up in West Texas, usually if you're in an interview setting, at least, back then, it might be changing, but at least at that time, usually that was, a feather in your cap. And more than likely, the person sitting across the table from you is also a Christian, and it works to your advantage. So it's not much of a cost to count. But when you're in an environment that's hostile to following Jesus, or an environment that there's mixed feelings about it, that's when we really are put to the test. And I'd like to believe that every single person in this room would be just as faithful if we were in an environment that was hostile to us being here, if in comparison to now. But we have to decide that before we ever reach that circumstance, right? Because if we ever do face that circumstance, you have to know already what you're going to do. You don't wait until you're put in the moment. So we need to count the cost. Any thoughts? Yeah, Jared.
I know your previous slide, it said what it's not teaching.
Yeah.
To neglect your family.
Uh-huh.
And 100% I agree with that. I do think what he's saying is, what are you willing to, A, walk away from, if it means that or serving me?
Yeah.
And B, what are you going to allow to stand between you and serving me?
Yeah.
And I think we, even today, even in this culture, as you were saying, we still have those moments that come where it's like, okay, am I going to allow this to come between me and serving God? Or am I willing to walk away from this to serve God? And I think, and I don't want to get ahead of you.
No, you're good.
But the rich young ruler that came to Jesus and said, what must I, came to Jesus, and he said, sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and follow me. And he went away sad because he loved his things. He loved his money, his status, his possessions. And
yeah.
I don't know that that's necessarily a commandment to everybody to sell everything you have, give it to the poor. But if that's what you're willing to come between you and God,
yeah,
I think that's what he was touching on in that moment.
Yeah, I don't think counting the cost is something that you really have to be honest with yourself about what could get in the way, or what might be getting in the way. Because I think most of the time when we reach the point where we would choose a relationship or an income level or a thing or an assortment of things over God, we're not really consciously realizing it. I think too often those sorts of things kind of creep up in terms of their importance in our minds, and there might be a point of realization, but it's often something that we don't even know consciously that we're doing. And I think the rich young ruler is an excellent example of that, because he obviously goes to Jesus feeling like he is righteous and he's doing all the right things, and yet he, at the end of the day, his heart was not to follow Jesus. So, well, how do I look at my own life and know whether or not I have truly counted the cost? And if I really am willing to lay down anything or any relationship, including my dearest loved ones, which I think is the point of this passage, if I'm not doing some self-examination and some prayer time and really thinking and meditating, and also building my relationship with God, kind of like what we talked about Sunday night, then I'm running the risk of blindly following someone or something else that's not Jesus as my number one. So I think that's why Jesus puts it in such strong terms. Jesus uses, I wouldn't say hyperbole, but he uses words in a way, sometimes figuratively, to give strength to what he's trying to convey to us. And I think that's what is meant in this passage when he's talking about the comparison of love and hate. Does that make sense? Does everybody, any other thoughts or comments? All right, I'm going to be honest with you. This first one was kind of a layup to get us warmed up. The next one's harder, but I think it's okay. So I forgot I had this slide. So I think key takeaway for Luke 14, the call of Christ is not easy, but it's worth everything. And that was something that we talked to the dogs. The dogs. So we call our Bible Bowl team with the high school boys the dogs. I'll tell the story. We were in our Bible Bowl class like last year, our last session, and we were writing something on the board, and I asked him a question, and I think it was Cooper Holland that was like, "Do what God says," was the answer he gave. And I started to write, "Do what God says" on the whiteboard, but I just wrote "do," and then I thought, I'm going to abbreviate the rest, and I wrote WGS. And the guys were like, "Dogs." And anyway, we all laughed about it, and then it became like kind of a running joke, and now we call them the dogs. And it's kind of, so if you hear us talk about the dogs, that's the high school Bible Bowl team. But sorry, had to explain. All right, so let's go to Luke 16. Luke 16, and let's start in verse 1. All right, the parable of the dishonest manager. He also said to his disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager.' And the manager said to himself, 'What shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses.' So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, 'How much do you owe to my master?' And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. And then he said to another, 'How much do you owe?' And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, 'Take your bill and write out 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of the world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you with true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. All right. This is pretty simple and straightforward, right? I don't think so. So I think this is actually one of the most challenging passages that we will deal with. And so, boy, we're going to start off strong, or we'll see. But what is this parable not teaching? I'm going to start with that. Well, does it mean when Jesus is talking about this, one verse in particular that I think is difficult to deal with is in verse 9, when he says, make friends by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. So we've got this dishonest manager caught wasting his master's money, and he's cutting deals with his master's debtors to secure his future. And then the twist, the surprise, is that the master commends him for his shrewdness. And what is it? Jesus said in verse 8, the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. So what is this parable not teaching? Again, these are going to feel obvious, but given what we just read, it might be confusing. Jesus is not endorsing dishonesty, right? That is not the aspect of this man's character that Jesus is commending to us. He's not saying that making money can get you saved or be a means to salvation. So the parallel is not in that. People can make that into something that it's not. And once again, Jesus isn't contradicting other teachings that he has on this subject. And I mean, you can see when he concludes in verse 13, that's the verse that people know well, right? No one can serve two masters. They'll hate the one or love the other, and devoted one or despise the other, and you cannot serve God and money. You hear that quoted a lot. The rest of this passage, this isn't the one that you usually store in memory. So what is this trying to teach us? I'll give you my take, but then I want to hear what you guys have to say after, all right? Because I think there's a lot of wisdom in this room, and I want to tap into that. But here's my take. Even though that manager is corrupt and dishonest in what he's doing, he's very strategic about how he's dealing with a problem. And I think that's what Jesus is highlighting. I think that word, when Jesus refers to his shrewdness, that shrewdness is not necessarily synonymous with dishonesty. It just means that he's wise in his dealing with the situation that he's been put into. Does that make sense? So one of the key lessons that I think we have here is that Jesus is pointing out that worldly people often show more wisdom in dealing with a prescient, difficult in the moment problem than sometimes even his followers or even religious people would do. So the manager's shrewdness, I think, is something that we need to take into account. He realized that he had temporary access to resources, and he needed to take swift action with what he still had at his disposal. So he's about to lose his job, right? And time is running out. And he knew that the one thing that he still had working to his advantage were the relationships that he had made as a manager on behalf of this man. And that's what he's going to deal in, right? He's working on the relationship side, and whatever deal he's cutting for these people who he's working with is later going to be a benefit to him. Okay? So I can take three things out of that I think are biblical. Our resources are temporary, our time is running out, and our relationships matter more, infinitely more than anything materially that we have. All right? There's a lot more, though, that I still want to go into, but let me just stop right there and see if anybody has anything they'd like to add or throw in. All right. It's okay.
You're not supposed to be of the world. You can be in the world, but not be part of the sins and so forth that the world does.
Yeah.
You back away from that stuff totally.
Yeah, in another passage, Jesus talks about being wise as serpents, but as innocent as doves, right? And I think that's similar to the concept that he's teaching here, in that when we operate in this world, we need to be wise to what is effective and what is, like, how the world works around us. But we also need to be people who are servants for good in using and applying that wisdom. So I don't believe, it's obvious on its face that the dishonesty that this manager is displaying in these dealings is not the point, okay? And otherwise, that would just fly in the face of so many other things that Jesus is teaching here. But another thing that I think is important to point out in the broader context of the passages in Luke, and I'm not sure that I would have appreciated this had we not been teaching through it in the Bible Bowl group, but it stands out to me that so many of the passages that precede this have to do with conversations that Jesus is having with Jews who are going to have to either accept or reject the fact that Jesus' kingdom is one that's going to include others, and their time as the exclusive people who have access to God is coming to an end. So I think there may also be parallels here in the relationship of the Jews, whose time is running out as the sort of servants of the master, and it's time to take some action. It's time to decide what they're going to do about it, because time is running out. So that also, I think, can play in parallel to this. But in terms of application for us, there's a few things I still wanted to get into, and specifically in verse 9. So he says, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. All right, so this particular verse is, I think, really key and also really difficult. But one thing that I want to point out that we know Jesus teaches is that earthly wealth will fail. It's temporary. Money is temporary. It's not going to last beyond this life. So we know Jesus said, don't hoard what's ultimately going to disappear, right? The whole point of, like, it's not about building bigger barns. Because you fool, this day your life is required of you, you know. So if we're not focused on earthly wealth doing us good in this time, then we should use money and any material means we have in this short time we have for eternal purposes. You see the parallel? So Jesus is not saying that money buys us heaven, but we can use money in a way that has an eternal impact. We can use our resources, our time, whatever we have at our disposal can be used to do good with what limited time we have. And we don't have much time. This life is a vapor. So when we use money for real needs to help people, when we support spreading the gospel, when we support the work of the church, when we use our whatever blessings that God has given us to not use it for our own selfish gain, but to invest it in our relationships with God and our relationship with people who may be turned to the gospel, that has a reward. And that's where I connect this idea of it says at the end, so when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. So who are our friends in eternity? I think that phrase, they may receive you into eternal dwellings, likely could refer to people who have been impacted by our generosity through gospel spreading effort. When we use resources and time supporting missions, helping the needy, spreading the gospel, and someone comes to faith and they precede us into heaven, one day they're going to be welcoming us there. And so I think that statement that Jesus is making here may indicate, again, I know I'm using a lot of words that are, I'm being a little tentative in my wording, but I think that Jesus is saying that what we invest, where we put our treasure, we're laying up treasure in heaven. And the people, the relationships that we have in this room, someday is part of that treasure that we get to enjoy when we're there. Doug?
I think this relates directly to the rich young ruler, Matthew 19, and, he asks Jesus, what, I've done all these commandments, what else do I still lack? And what does Jesus tell him? If you want to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven.
Yeah.
He's somebody who is focused on wealth for himself, and he enjoys that wealth for himself.
Yeah.
And he obviously needs to learn that lesson.
Yeah. And it's a hard lesson.
It's one that I think we can be really self-deceived in, and including myself in that. I don't want to be like the Pharisee that's looking at examples like the rich young ruler, and I'm thanking God that I'm not like this, this man. We live in a very blessed, materially blessed culture. I think we all agree on that. And so I think it's really easy for us to prioritize material wealth and lose sight of what really matters. So I think the dishonest manager, just to sum up, be wise with what you have at your disposal, your resources, and don't use them just to build comfort here in this life, in this moment. Use them to build up the kingdom and to bless people. And that's really where we get to have something that's going to last forever, the treasure that we're laying up in heaven. Yes, Philip.
I can kind of see this, follow along what you're saying, as Jesus giving us an investment strategy that completely turns our ideas on its head.
Yeah.
Because we're looking for the biggest interest. What are we going to, when we invest in something, what are we going to get back?
Right.
In terms of the money coming back to us. And he's saying there's a different investment strategy that should take priority. And you think about the examples we have in Scripture of people who made investments like this. Well, the first one I thought of was Barnabas, sold the field, laid the money out at the apostles' feet, and Scripture makes a big point about that. Even a bigger point is that Jesus and his disciples are watching people put money in the treasury, and a widow puts in a copper coin, everything she had to live on. And that right there is lifted up as the greatest investment that someone would make.
Yeah.
And there's big, maybe there's more. We thought about it and brainstormed, think of Dorcas, maybe, or Lydia, making clothes and giving them out to people. And those are mentioned as a very high priority. Not really much is said about those who had earthly wealth, other than they gave it away, Zacchaeus and others, when they gave it away. And then another point I saw that we could probably add to one of the slides what Jesus is saying. This idea of shrewdness is a virtue. What does it mean to be shrewd? Well, we're looking it up. I think it means really sharp judgment.
Yeah.
You really do. You're really smart about what you do.
Yeah.
And verse 8, he mentions that people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light. and how we need to be. I almost think of the word shrewd as almost having a negative connotation,
Right.
but it doesn't seem to be that way.
No, I don't think so, at least not in this context.
Yeah.
And what you just said about that word reminds me, I mean, I was just in Proverbs this past week, in Proverbs 8, but there's, and it's also in Proverbs 3. Proverbs 3 and Proverbs 8 are very similar, which is standing out this week as we're reading it. But, that idea of getting insight. And insight, that word in the Hebrew, has the connotation of understanding how things really work, and I think someone who's shrewd knows how things really work, and you're not, so it's almost more difficult to maintain an earnest heart and sincerity when you see behind the curtain and the way things really work. I mean, aren't we as a culture very jaded about institutions because something about the curtain has pulled back a little bit and we can see, I mean, I don't want to get political, but I think we know what I'm referring to when we say we can see there's a lot of corruption, a lot of ugliness when the curtain gets pulled back, when we understand how things really work. And I think when we have that insight, to not become, like I said, jaded, or someone who just has a cynical worldview is very difficult. And the only way that I think you can fight that and still maintain an earnest heart is to have a deep relationship with Jesus. Because if you let that cynicism and that jaded worldview take over, then everybody's got an angle, and nothing can be trusted. And that is poison. And that can work its way in. You don't even realize how insidious that is. But, there comes a point in your heart where you won't even trust something as pure and good as God if you have that take over. So I think just going back to the living water and day by day being refreshed by the goodness of the Lord and just the goodness of His truth, and not investing our hearts in our money or in the things that make us happy in the short term, those are going to protect our hearts, and that becomes attractive to the broken and lost world. I think as people feel cynical and jaded, they lose hope. And of all people, we should be the ones who have hope.
Amen.
And so that's another way that as followers of Jesus, we can shine a light. We can be something different. We can say, come and see, to our friends who don't understand why we seem to have such a hope. Yes, Doug.
And to not be afraid to work.
And to not be afraid to work.
Because that worldly shrewdness comes from hard work.
Yeah.
It may be motivated by greed and selfishness, but it takes hard work to accumulate that worldly wealth.
Yeah.
So we should be willing to work that way in the kingdom, that we're shrewdly trying to earn what we can to benefit others, and hopefully that's going to grow, that eternal kingdom.
No, you're right. And hard work and being willing to devote ourselves to things and I always think of was it Kyle that said one time, you just gotta pick up something heavy. I like that. But you've gotta have that mindset of being able to work. There's on the other, I'm not trying to be this guy, but there's also the other side of that where we can make work our God. And just like anything, it's like there's the sluggard, the guy who doesn't want to work, and it's even hard for him in the Proverbs to raise his hand to his mouth to feed himself. But then there's the other guy, and I think this happens too. You get so married to your work and to earning and to that paycheck, and you know what, before you know it, your kids are grown up and they don't even have a relationship with you. Or your marriage is falling apart because you don't take time. Or you have no investment in your time with the church or your relationships with church family because you're always busy. So we have to always just keep our eyes on who is my king? And the answer must always be Jesus. He is my king. It must always
Be my answer, and I have to daily look at my life and think about it. Sorry, I just get on a roll and I keep going. Sorry. What other comments? I was wondering if I might need to get into another passage, but y'all are helping here.
Paul's prayer in Philippians 1 kind of deals with this idea of shrewdness a little bit. There's a lot to unpack here. There's Philippians 1, 9 through 11. And this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best, and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. So as we grow in His love, in our knowledge, in our insight, we have a gift of discernment, which to me seems to be related to shrewdness.
Yeah.
So it's all part of the package.
Right.
As we grow in that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that word that you keep coming back to, shrewdness, insight, is what I keep wanting to sub in, or just the way things really work and being wise to it, but using that wisdom for God's glory. And when we gain insight, when we have shrewdness about the way things are around us, and all the brokenness that goes along with that, we still look to God and Jesus Christ as King and follow Him. Yeah.
I keep thinking, it makes me think of like when He does make that comparison of like, people of this world and sons of light, like how, when you're in the world and you're dealing in business and you have to think all strategically and stuff, and like, are we thinking strategically about the kingdom of God? Are we thinking, how can we strategically get more people to know God? Are we making plans? Are we being intentional? Like we go meet with our financial planner and do all this stuff. Like, are we thinking like that?
That's true.
The kingdom of God.
Yeah.
I mean, I know I'm saying that to myself, but like that's an eye-opening thing. Like that's what I see kind of the contrast there.
Yeah, I mean, I do some business consulting, and we're always talking about how you win the game of strategy. You want to put yourself on a playing field of your choice so that you win. But we don't often think about how we can, in the playing field of this world, so to speak, try to bring glory to God's kingdom. How am I going to most effectively, most strategically get the word out to the lost and people who are spiritually dying about the good news that will save them? Am I thinking about that enough? Am I doing anything? Because I don't want to just be thinking, I also want to be doing. And I want to bear fruit, and I want the efforts that I have to bear fruit. Because ultimately, all the good intentions in the world don't bring somebody to Christ unless you have the conversation. All the good intentions in the world don't show your brother or sister in Christ who's suffering how much you love them unless you go and show it. And so I agree, we need to be people who feel that urgency because we don't know how long we have. We need to be thinking strategically and with urgency, how can I use the little time that I have and the little resources at my disposal to lay up treasure in heaven and be shrewd about it.
Fortunately, for me, a lot of times for me to see, shrewdness in presenting the gospel or something. It's real easy for me to see Satan is so shrewd.
Yeah.
If you look at the techniques and the ways that are used to promote all of this stuff that bombard our kids.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not coming in and hitting our kids over the head with a 2-4. They're very shrewdly just
Yeah.
interjecting that's here, there, and, we need to use some of the same.
Yeah, we need to be wise and effective.
For good. Yeah. Thank you all. Great comments tonight. Really appreciate it. And next week we'll come back and we'll try to dive into some more hard sayings. So if you got any that you have in mind, let me know. Maybe we'll take a crack at it. But thank you for your comments.